I want to tell you about a devastating event that happened last summer in the desolate desert of Arizona. This isn't your typical ghost story, but a horrifying experience that still leaves me shaking every time I look in the mirror. I swear every single detail is true, proving that even the most advanced security systems can be completely useless against human malice. Right after that night, I quit my job, moved to a big city, and swore I'd never work a night shift again. At the time, I was working as a night shift security guard at a massive, isolated self-storage facility on the edge of the Phoenix desert. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., a time when the place was completely deserted with zero witnesses around. If anything went wrong, the nearest police station was over a 40-minute drive away. With 5 years of experience in security, I wasn't the type to get easily spooked by the dark or the loneliness of the desert. That night started off completely normal, just the usual repetitive routine. I was sitting safely inside my bulletproof glass booth, with the door locked tight by a high-security keypad system. I was sipping on some cold coffee, mindlessly staring at the quiet security monitors. Outside the glass booth, the desert darkness swallowed the storage units like a massive trap waiting to spring. At exactly 1:30 a.m., the computer system suddenly let out a series of rapid warning beeps. The monitor flashed red text, warning that someone had entered the wrong passcode 4 consecutive times at Unit 404 on the very last row. I knew something was off because this unit was supposed to be sealed for maintenance, according to the daytime manager's report. I controlled camera number 9, panning it toward that back row to check. Through the grainy, static-heavy feed, a woman in a white nightgown, completely barefoot, was frantically pounding on the metal roll-up door. Her hair was completely disheveled, and she kept looking over her shoulder as if being hunted by an invisible threat. Allowed me to call the police immediately, but company rules required me to verify over the intercom, first to avoid a false alarm. I decided to stay safely inside and reached out to switch on the internal loudspeaker microphone to tell her to leave. But the exact moment my finger touched the button, my entire body froze as I glanced at the monitor for camera number 1. That was the security camera monitoring my actual workspace. On that screen, the woman in the white nightgown was actually standing right behind my neck. She was pressing her face flat against the reflective glass, eyes wide open, staring directly at me from behind. Every nerve in my body stretched taut as I stared at 2 monitors showing completely contradictory images. Monitor 9 was still playing the footage of the woman pounding on the unit door, but camera 1 clearly showed her standing right behind my back. This horrifying mismatch proved that someone had tampered with the surveillance system beforehand. Terror kept me from turning around, leaving me frantically typing on the keyboard to pretend everything was normal. The air inside the security booth turned ice cold, and my heavy breathing echoed loudly in the room. Suddenly, the sound of fingernails scratching against the reinforced glass made a bone-chilling, screeching noise. The woman pressed her mouth close to the small ventilation slit at the bottom of the door and whispered in a raspy, strained voice, "Guard, please don't look at the screen. He's tricking you. I'm the one who just escaped from Unit 404. The daytime manager locked me alive in there for a week to extort money. I just managed to pry open the vent mesh to crawl out. Please, save me." Her broken words completely shattered my understanding of the current situation. If the person outside the glass was real, then the figure on camera 9 was just pre-recorded footage used to lure me out of the secure booth. I realized with utter horror that I had fallen into a killer's trap, and he was incredibly close. Monitor 9 suddenly switched to a sharp infrared mode. The figure on the screen stopped pounding on the door and snapped around to stare directly into the camera. Under the pale green light, I recognized with absolute horror that it was the daytime manager. Holding a short axe in his hand, the computer system suddenly blared a piercing red alert alarm. All the passcodes for the security booth had been overwritten and locked remotely using his administrative account. The room instantly turned into a sealed trap, and I completely lost control of the door. My only goal now was survival, so I frantically grabbed a small crowbar from under the desk for self-defense. A loud snap echoed from the fuse box, and the entire facility lost power, plunging into thick darkness. Heavy, rapid footsteps echoed down the hallway, accompanied by the sound of an iron axe blade scraping against the metal walls. Sparking in the dark, the woman outside the glass panicked, pounding on the door and begging me to unlock it. I didn't open the door, but leaned out toward the ventilation slit, using all my strength to pull her down flat against the wall. Both of us held our breath in absolute silence as the killer's flashlight beam swept right over our heads through the glass. The manager stood still outside the glass for a few more minutes that felt like eternity. I could clearly hear him panting through the ventilation slit, and the sound of the axe blade tapping rhythmically against the concrete ledge. Finding no one, he lost his patience and walked away toward the back parking lot. The pickup truck's engine roared to life and then slowly faded into the desolate desert night. Even though the sound of the truck had completely died out, the woman and I still hid in the darkness for the next 3 hours. When the first light of dawn appeared, I used the manual backup key to unlock the security booth door. We helped each other run for our lives out to the main highway to wave down a vehicle for help. 2 weeks later, in another city, I was frozen with horror while watching the news on television. The police had captured him at the Mexican border and discovered the dismembered bodies of 2 other victims inside Unit 404. I realized that if I had left the glass booth to check the rows according to the company rules that night, I would have been the 3rd corpse. I quit my job immediately and swore I would never return to the security industry again. The incident left a massive psychological scar, making me constantly paranoid that surveillance cameras are just a deceptive trap. I refused to testify in court out of fear of retaliation from his accomplices, who haven't all been caught yet. Now every night, just the sound of the wind lightly scratching against the window is enough to make me snap awake, drenched in sweat. I am still haunted by the question of whether he acted alone that night, or if there is still an anonymous accomplice out there holding the passcode to my room and quietly watching me from behind. I never thought I would have to run away from Chicago. That place used to be everything I ever dreamed of for a vibrant urban lifestyle. But everything shattered after that terrible night at the convenience store on the corner of Cicero Avenue. An armed robbery happened while I was standing in line to pay. The sound of the gunshots firing right past my ear was so intense that it took away part of my temporary hearing and left a psychological scar that could not heal. My psychiatrist told me that I had developed a severe case of phonophobia due to the trauma. Do you know that feeling when your chest always tightens and trembles whenever there is a sudden noise? It is like your body is always bracing for a violent impact, but that impact never comes. Every angry car horn on the street or the rumbling of the subway felt like a jolt of electricity straight to my nerves. I could not keep living in a place where even the loud slamming of a neighbor's door made me jump out of my skin in panic. I needed to escape from that noise to save myself. I began to look for a safe and completely isolated shelter on house rental websites, and then I found a small 2-story house with a white wooden fence buried deep in a quiet suburb of Ohio. The house sat at the end of a dead-end street and was surrounded by tall old oak trees. The distance between the houses here was quite far, and that guaranteed I would not have to hear any daily life noises from other people. This place seemed like it was born just for me. There were no public car horns and no chaotic noises of crowds passing by on the streets. Everything around was so quiet that I could clearly hear the wind brushing through the leaves during the day. To celebrate finding an ideal shelter after a long period of crisis, I decided to host a small barbecue party in the backyard on the first weekend evening. I invited a few old friends from the city and 1 or 2 neighbors living at the top of the street to attend. The party was very fun and cozy, exactly what I had expected from a peaceful new life. I thought that I was truly safe at this house, but that peace turned out to be just a deception paving the way for a nightmare that was 100 times more terrifying. Around 10 p.m., when the guests had all left, I went to the backyard to clean up the grill and the paper plates. The space had now returned to the inherent silence of the Ohio suburbs. As I was bending down to pick up a few empty cans, I suddenly felt like someone was watching me. I raised my head and froze in terror when I saw a figure standing dead still, right against the wooden fence dividing the 2 houses. It was Richard, my middle-aged neighbor. He stood completely rigid, with half of his body submerged in the darkness of the oak tree shadow, and his eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the glowing embers dying out in the barbecue grill. His eyes did not blink even once. I tried to stay polite and called out a greeting to break this bizarre atmosphere. But Richard did not answer in a normal way. He slowly spoke in a flat, monotone voice that was stiff like an old tape recorder. The weather in Ohio this season is really perfect for an outdoor barbecue, isn't it, my friend? His sentence completely lacked the natural inflections of a human being, and the rhythm of his pauses was terrifyingly soulless. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, but still forced a social smile and nodded in agreement. I told myself that maybe people in this rural area just had a slightly eccentric and reclusive way of communicating compared to city folks. I turned back to finish gathering the remaining things quickly so I could go inside. 15 minutes later, when I was about to carry the last tray of items up, Richard was still standing in that exact same position without moving an inch. The motion sensor light at the corner of my yard suddenly snapped off because the timer ran out, pushing both of us into the thick darkness of the night. Amidst the silence where I could clearly hear the crickets chirping, Richard's voice rang out again from the fence. It was the exact same words, the exact same stiff tone, and the exact same pauses as 15 minutes ago. The weather in Ohio this season is really perfect for an outdoor barbecue, isn't it, my friend? That absolute match in sound made my hair stand on end. I abandoned the tray on the table, rushed straight into the house, and locked the back door tight. Around 1 a.m., a light but urgent knocking at the front door woke me up. I walked over, looked through the peephole, and saw Richard standing there under the porch light. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low to hide half of his face, and his expression looked very panicked. I cracked the door open slightly, keeping the security chain engaged. Richard immediately put his ear close to mine and whispered very quickly, "There is a stranger lurking in the backyard of my house. He is wearing a black coat. Be careful and lock the second-floor windows tight." He turned his back and walked away immediately into the night without waiting for my answer. I stood behind the living room window curtain, watching his shadow, and began to reflect on the warning. A serious, logical flaw appeared in my mind. Richard's backyard was enclosed by a solid 2-meter brick wall. If a prowler broke in from that direction, how could Richard run around to my front door that fast without making a single sound on the gravel road? The suspicion in me changed instantly. I began to think that Richard himself was the threat, or he was playing some twisted psychological game to scare me. To relieve my anxiety, I decided to check all the windows on the second floor, just like he said. When I walked into the spare bedroom overlooking the backyard, I was horrified to find a wet trail of mud clearly imprinted on the windowsill. The window lock had been pried broken from the outside, and the curtain was gently swaying, even though the night wind was not too strong. That person was already here. The isolation at the end of the dead-end street now turned the house into a perfect trap with no way out. I immediately pulled out my phone to call the police for help, but my phone screen displayed absolutely no cellular service. I realized I had completely lost control of the situation. A loud noise from the ground floor rang out, cutting off all my thoughts. It was the sound of heavy footsteps, thudding one by one on the wooden floor, heading straight toward the stairs. I knew I had no way out anymore. I rushed into the bathroom at the end of the second-floor hallway and bolted the door from the inside. My hand grabbed a rusty iron bar I had found in the corner of the room, clutching it tightly to my body for defense. Right after that, a violent banging pounded on the bathroom door, as if someone was repeatedly smashing a sledgehammer against the wooden planks. The door shook violently, looking like it would collapse at any second. My safe shelter had completely shattered. I heard the wood splintering and cracking, and a familiar voice rang out from outside the door. But this time, it was a distorted and frantic scream from Richard. The weather in Ohio this season is really perfect for an outdoor barbecue. I squeezed my eyes shut and held my head, preparing for a life or death struggle as the bathroom door was about to give in to the terrifying strength outside. Suddenly, the banging stopped dead. Instead, the urgent wailing of police sirens and red and blue lights swept through the bathroom ventilation window. Someone had called the police before I could even do it. When I stepped outside under the protection of 3 armed officers, they led me to the backyard to take my statement. They showed me a horrifying truth right at the wooden fence. The high-powered headlights of the patrol cars lit up the entire corner of the backyard. The neighbor, Richard, whom I had stood talking to earlier that evening, was actually just a dried corpse with shriveled, grayish skin. The corpse was intricately propped upright with stiff iron wires and a complex system of fishing lines connected straight to the wooden fence. The police officer told me that the real Richard had died 3 weeks ago, right inside his house, from a home invasion, robbery, and murder. The person who had talked to me, The person who had knocked on the door to warn me, and the person who had smashed the bathroom door, was the twisted killer who had murdered Richard. He had been hiding in the abandoned house next door the entire time, using the victim's corpse as a puppet to play games with me, his new prey. As for the voice from earlier that evening, it came from a mini tape recorder attached to the back of the corpse's neck, which he controlled from a distance. That twisted killer managed to escape through the back door of Richard's house before the police could seal off the entire dead-end street. I did not dare to stay in that house, with the white wooden fence, for even one more minute. I immediately gathered my most essential belongings, threw them into the trunk of my car, and moved into a crowded hotel right in the center of the city that very night. My plan to find a peaceful and healing life in the Ohio suburbs had completely shattered. Silence to me was no longer a cure, but a lingering trauma that was synonymous with death and deception. My already fragile nervous system was torn apart 100 times worse than before. The initial phonophobia had now turned into a paranoid fear of empty, quiet spaces. As I sat in the safety of my hotel room with the streetlights casting shadows through the window, I received a call from an unknown number at 3 a.m. I trembling pulled up the phone, but there was no human voice on the other end. There was only the distinct sound of crickets chirping from the Ohio suburbs and the low hum of a cassette tape playing a familiar, stiff tone. "The weather today is really perfect." The call abruptly cut off right after that sentence. I sat frozen on the bed and realized that two horrifying possibilities existed. Either that flesh and blood killer was still stalking me, having stolen my personal information from the old house, and was continuing this psychological terror game in the real world, or some dark spiritual force had possessed Richard's corpse, and the fact that it knew my new phone number was something that could not be explained by normal logic. The question of whether a human puppet master or a demon was standing down on the street, looking up at my hotel window, would forever remain an unanswered mystery. I haven't dared to work alone in the dark for the past 3 months. Every time I see an old radio or hear static coming from a speaker, my whole body goosebumps, and a suffocating feeling of anxiety overwhelms my mind. This fear doesn't come from the scary ghost stories people usually tell to frighten each other. It comes from a real man, an anonymous person who possesses a raspy voice and knows way too much about my life. The isolated radio station where I used to think was the safest place has now become a psychological trap-off, keeping me in absolute panic. Have you ever experienced the feeling of realizing your isolated space has been intruded by someone else without you even knowing? I used to be an audio technician in charge of the night shift at WBI radio station. The station is located in isolation, on the edge of a small town in Wisconsin, surrounded only by open fields and trees. My companion during the long shifts from midnight to morning was Silas. Silas was a middle-aged man who lived a private life, but was very gentle. He had been with this radio station for 10 years and was always the one to prepare bags of stale donuts and a warm pot of coffee for the two of us to kill time together. Our job had a very peaceful, repetitive routine. Every day at 1 a.m. after switching to the automated night music playlist, I and Silas would sit in the control room, drinking coffee while turning on the internal intercom connected straight to the old technical basement beneath the building to check the parameters. It was a night of widespread heavy rain and storm that cut off power to the entire town. Our radio station still operated normally thanks to a large backup generator behind the house. The torrential rain, slamming hard against the corrugated iron roof, created an extremely warm atmosphere that was completely cut off from the outside world. Everything at that time was going perfectly and safely until the clock struck the next hour, right at 2 a.m. while the playlist was running smoothly over the airwaves. The digital mixer screen in front of me suddenly started jumping frequencies, chaotically. A long, piercing, static buzz abruptly cut into the ballad track that was playing halfway. Following that was a series of intermittent static noises that were incredibly deafening. I frowned looking at the screen and reached out to adjust the signal sliders. In my mind at that time, I just thought simply that the heavy storm outside was causing signal interference from the high-voltage transmission towers. Silas, who was sitting eating pastries in the corner of the room, then looked up, reacting quite calmly. He just shook his head and told me to check the jacks and the main bandpass filters. Silas's attitude was completely normal, without a single sign of panic or anxiety. I did as he said, but just exactly 5 minutes later, that anomaly repeated for the second time. This time it was not just static noise, but a very faint sigh slipping into the recording band. The frequency of those static noises grew more dense and rapid. Regularly, every 2 minutes, the audio system was interrupted in an absurd way. Frustration began to build up, and I angrily shoved the volume sliders down to try to kill the noise, but all buttons were useless. The warm private atmosphere of the studio was now completely shattered. A suffocating feeling enveloped me as I realized this noise was not caused by the weather, but was trying to shape itself into an intentional sound structure. Silas began to show signs of anxiety, unable to sit still. He stood up, walking back and forth around the cramped room, constantly casting his eyes out the dark window full of rainwater. His lips moved, muttering about how the underground cable system might have leaked a signal somewhere. But Silas's constantly darting eyes showed me he seemed to be hiding something truly terrible from me. Every bit of static noise suddenly vanished, leaving behind a silence that was utterly spine-chilling. But that brief relief instantly shattered when a man's raspy voice echoed directly from the monitor speakers. The sound was cold and clear as day, as if he were standing right next to me. That person wasn't speaking the nonsense of a random listener prank calling a radio station. He called out my name with absolute precision. "Hello, Luke." Right after that, he began reciting the exact color of the jacket I was wearing and the brand of the coffee mug I was holding in my hand. I froze completely on the spot, almost dropping my phone out of sheer terror. An itchy, goosebump-inducing sensation crawled all over my body, proving that I was being watched directly from some dark corner. I wanted to scream out and ask who he was, but my throat was so tight that no sound came out. The situation turned into a horrifying psychological manhunt, as the mysterious man continued to list intimate details about my home address and my relatives. I realized this was completely different from a strange technical glitch. It was a targeted threat aimed straight at us. The voice on the monitor speakers suddenly paused for a beat, then let out a faint, haunting chuckle. He declared that his true target tonight wasn't me. He said he came here for Silas, for the man who was deliberately trying to bury his past beneath this isolated radio station. Hearing those words, the color immediately drained from Silas's face. He stumbled backward in sheer panic, accidentally knocking a whole stack of files off the desk, scattering them all over the floor. Silas's eyes were filled with absolute horror, as if he were facing a ghost straight out of hell. Unable to endure this mental torture any longer, I rushed forward, shut down the entire main broadcasting system, and cut the power to the mixer. The control room instantly plunged into the absolute silence of darkness and the raging storm. Our normal night shift routine had completely collapsed, and there was no turning back. When the entire main speaker system was shut off, the control room was left with nothing but the heavy breathing of Silas and me. But that silence did not last long when a familiar static buzz echoed once again from a corner of the room. The source of the sound was not from the mixer, but from the internal intercom sitting on the corner of the desk. The raspy voice of the mysterious man spoke up again, full of mockery through the small speaker of the intercom. He declared that he was standing very close, and was about to step up the stairs to enter the control room to finish everything with Silas. Fear turned into absolute panic, and I rushed toward the desk, intending to grab the intercom to demand who he was and where he was in this storm-isolated building. But before I could even touch the device, Silas lunged forward as fast as lightning, with an extremely decisive movement. He ripped the power cord right out of the intercom and used all his might to smash it against the brick wall in front of us. The intercom shattered into pieces, completely silencing the voice of that man. I turned around and screamed straight into Silas's face, demanding to know why he dared destroy the only clue for us to know where the enemy was in this isolated stormy night. Responding to my anger, Silas did not explain at all, but only looked at me with an eye expression that had completely changed. It was no longer the eyes of the familiar, gentle colleague of many years, but a cold, terrifying defensiveness. There were no footsteps coming up the stairs, and no killer pushed open the door to enter the control room. The identity and location of the anonymous caller were left entirely hanging in the pitch blackness of the radio station. Silas silently sat down in the corner of the room, holding his head in absolute silence, offering no explanation whatsoever for the accusations made by the voice on the air. His dreadful silence made my mind begin to connect the fractures of trust that had already existed before. I suddenly remembered that for the past 10 years, Silas had never told anyone at this radio station about his family or his hometown. Every time I asked about the reason why an audio expert with such good skills like him would accept coming to a remote town to work the night shift for a measly salary, he always dodged the question. And those long scars that looked like knife cuts hidden behind his jacket sleeves too. Now, sitting in the dark room, I suddenly realized the most horrifying truth was not the anonymous person on the other end of the line. It was the fact that I was locked in the same room with a man full of dangerous secrets and completely a stranger for all these years. The danger was no longer outside, but could be standing right next to me in the dark. 3 months have passed since that horrifying night at WBI radio station. I submitted my resignation letter the very next week and moved completely to a big city to find a normal office job. But the psychological consequences left behind by that event still continue to haunt me every single day. Every time I accidentally hear the static buzz of a television losing its signal, or a sudden static noise from a phone speaker, my heart beats wildly inside my chest and cold sweat pours all over my body. My new rented room always has to have all the lights turned on, even when I go to sleep. But the feeling of someone staring at me from those dark, hidden corners never completely disappears. Silas vanished mysteriously the very next morning after that event. He didn't leave behind any resignation letter, and no one in town could contact him anymore. Silas's sudden and absolute silence was like a gaping black hole, swallowing every bit of peace in my mind. The local police conducted a thorough search of the radio station and the old basement underneath, according to my statement. But they found absolutely no trace of any stranger or any break-in. The station's underground cable system was also inspected and showed no signs of being tapped or tampered with from the outside. Any possibility of a malicious prank by the local youth was ruled out, because that night the entire town lost power and the internal intercom system could only operate within the perimeter of the building. I have to live in suspense and vigilance every single day with questions that will never have an answer. I always wonder who that man with the raspy voice really was, and what Silas had done in his past to be hunted all the way to this place. That mysterious person is definitely still out there, and he holds all of my personal information. Just last night, while I was sitting alone in the living room of my new apartment, reading a book, the screen of my phone sitting on the table suddenly lit up on its own, even though there were no notifications. And from the speakerphone of the device, a familiar static buzz echoed faintly, accompanied by a very soft sigh, and then went dead.